Medieval swords weren't really very sharp, nothing more than sharpened crowbars in fact, and certainly nowhere near as sharp as the samurai sword. Actually, I think you'll find that medieval European swords were extremely sharp, every bit as much as a Japanese sword. So here's the problem, there's a very polarized situation with medieval European swords. Were they really sharp, or were they actually quite blunt? Let's look at the context. Hi folks, Matty's here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, as many of you will realise from long years watching this channel, hopefully, and many more to come, I hope, that I've been spending a lot of time studying medieval swords. In fact, since my university days, going back 20, for God knows how many years now, nearly 30 years. I have had the great pleasure and honour of studying real original medieval swords at places like the Royal Armouries and various other museums in Austria and Italy and all over the place. And in addition to that, I've also, as a former head of arms and armour at London Auction House, but additionally continuing to be an antique arms and armour dealer myself through Easton Antique Arms, but also doing some work with auction houses, for example, like Olympia Auctions or William Wallace. I've managed to handle a lot of original medieval and Renaissance swords over the years. So I think I have a fairly good idea of the real answer to this question of, were medieval swords actually really sharp? And there is actually a definitive answer of sorts to this question, so you won't be disappointed by this video, hopefully. So we're going to look at medieval swords. Were they sharp? Were they not? And why? Just briefly before we go on, I want a quick word about our amazing sponsors for this video, who are Surfshark. Now, I've actually been using Surfshark for a few months now. It's absolutely great, really instinctive to use, and it does exactly what you need. And you guys know that I always use protection, whether it's one of my new helmets or it's just practicing my parries and footwork. And it's no different in my online activity either. Now, Surfshark, of course, is a VPN. That's a virtual private network. You might be using one right now, and if you're not already, well, why wait? In fact, now's a great time to get started because I've got a fantastic offer for you right here. In the last few months, I've actually been traveling a lot, both for work and for pleasure, including places like Serbia and all around the UK, and Surfshark has been absolutely invaluable to me. I always use Surfshark when I'm in hotels, airports, train stations, connecting to Wi-Fi. I simply wouldn't feel safe without it. You know, even your webcam can be accessed, so using Surfshark, it's really important to protect yourself, whether you're gaming, using social media, or even in a video chat. And Surfshark is a no-logs VPN. That means even they can't monitor your data. You know, one of the things that I've used Surfshark for is to get more out of Netflix, because obviously there's geographic limitations on what you can view on Netflix based on where you are. You can change your location, and lo and behold, you can view shows that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. One of the other great things is it's unlimited devices. So unlike many VPNs, you can connect to as many devices as you like. So if you want to try out Surfshark right now, there's no risk at all, because you get a 30-day money-back guarantee and there's 24/7 support available. So go to surfshark.com/scholarshark or use code SCHOLARSHARK at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN. There's no risk at all. Check out that link down below, use my code on screen, and you can thank me later. So thanks a lot for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the main topic of this video, and I'm gonna break it down into 3 elements. First of all, were medieval swords sharp? Well, we have to first of all break down, what does medieval mean? We need to break down, what does sharp really mean? And lastly, we need to talk about types of sword. Now, to answer those 3 questions, or 3 points, the first thing that we're going to look at is sharpness. Now, often how sharpness is defined is, for example, taking a piece of paper and seeing, for example, how easily does your edge of your knife cut into that piece of paper. In the cases of this knife, kind of mediocre. There we go, if we get the... So that is often how people will define how sharp a blade it actually is. But in the context of medieval swords, we have to really broaden the definition of sharpness to include a few other factors. For a start, not only is the sharpness in this particular context just the amount of bite that the edge has and the fineness of the edge, being able to slice paper, for example, but also we have to talk about edge geometry. What angle is that edge bevel, and how much meat is behind that blade, because that very much affects how easily the blade will pass through a target. It's not only the edge sort of contact sharpness, but it's also the nature of the edge bevel and the cross section of the blade at passing through a target, which will have a huge effect on how effectively it actually cuts stuff. A blade can be extremely fine to touch and at the edge, and it might cut through paper fairly well, but if it's got too much meat, if the edge is too apple-seeded or the edge bevel is too broad, chisel-like, then quite simply, whilst you might be able to slice through things like carrots or your finger very, very easily at the edge here, when you actually try and cut through targets, you'll meet a lot of resistance, because after that initial contact with the edge, which is contacting with the, is leading like the prow of a boat, everything behind it is adding friction to passing through the target, making it harder to cut, and therefore giving the effect essentially of seeming less sharp. Now, this can also be altered by the user by meeting the target at oblique angles. For example, at 45 degrees, it will lessen the bevel edge angle, or indeed with a curved blade as well. So you can do things to mitigate that and to help the blade pass through a target, but we're not really considering the kind of swordsmanship aspect here. We're just looking at the sword as a static object. We even have to take into consideration aspects of hardness of the material. How hard is it at the edge? Because you could start off extremely sharp, but if it's a soft material, let's say it was just made of mild steel or iron, then it would blunten quite quickly. So despite the fact that you've sharpened it incredibly well, as soon as you start to impact things, human targets or even clothing or shields or anything like this, or pole arms, this edge will dull very, very quickly, and that even affects the nature of scabbards as well. So certain swords, obviously in later centuries, they sometimes used metal scabbards being of iron or brass, and they have famously a tendency to blunt the edges. But even wooden scabbards and leather scabbards have some degree of friction, and that has some degree of blunting effect on the very bite of the edge. But that's mitigated by having a very hard material to the edge, because it's less likely to be blunted by the relatively much softer material. Okay, so there are a number of things at play here when we're talking about sharpness. Is how sharp is the actual contact of the edge? What is the edge bevel and the cross section of the blade like? What's the hardness of the blade like? And to some extent even, what kind of scabbard is it kept in as well? Because, and how it's maintained. How often is it resharpened? Because all of those things will affect, in reality, the day-to-day average sharpness of a typical medieval sword. So hopefully you're already realizing that just simply answering the question of how sharp were medieval swords is a somewhat complicated question. Now moving on to the term medieval. There is a problem with the term medieval as well, because what do we mean? This is a type of sword from the 15th century. This is a type of sword from the 8th century. Both of those are medieval, so generally speaking, according to modern history conventions, the medieval period basically covers about 500 to 1500. That's 1,000 years. Now, arms and equipment changed an awful lot in that time. Not only did the swords change a lot, and we'll come back to that point in the next section, but of course everything else changed about the context of swords, how they were used, warfare, armour. We'll come back to armour in a second, but also society. Society changed. The fact is that swords like this were used in street duels, knightly duels, tournaments, and of course war. Swords like this were occasionally used in duels, not very much. Obviously there was the Viking duel with its own set of rules, but there's no suggestion that they happened very often. These weren't carried by very many people in that society, because swords were much rarer in the 8th or 9th century than they were in the 14th and 15th century. And of course, the people that carried them might be different. You know, a common person could have a sword in many parts of late medieval Europe. Common people didn't have many swords in the so-called Dark Ages, kind of the pre-1000 AD years. So society changed, the context in which these used, both in civilian and military life, changed, and of course the actual swords themselves changed hugely during that time. Which leads us nicely onto the third section, which is sword type. So answering the question was were medieval swords sharp? what type of medieval sword? There was a huge variety. So clearly, if we're looking at the earlier part of the medieval period, the early Middle Ages all the way up to the High Middle Ages, in fact, most swords were predominantly cutting weapons, from the Roman Sparta right the way through these sort of type 10 and then later type 11 and 12, broad, relatively cut-centric swords. Yes, indeed, you could thrust with them, and indeed some Roman Sparta actually look more like thrusting swords than cutting swords. But generally speaking, these are cut-centric swords in the first part of the Middle Ages, and they tend to be broader, with a broad, shallow fuller, or sometimes a sort of almost lenticular or kind of oval section with sharpened edges, of course. So they are a particular thing, a particular type of sword, predominantly used against male or nothing. Okay, so swords in this period are that way because if they're going to encounter any armor at all, and many times soldiers, I mean, you can look at the Bayeux tapestry, for example, some soldiers don't have any armor, so they're going to mostly encounter clothes, or if they are going to encounter armor, it's mostly going to be mail, aka chainmail, on the body. But of course at that point this is a shirt, so the lower arms, the lower legs are very often uncovered, and the face very often as well, with one plate, and that being on the top of the head. Obviously as time goes on, swords evolve somewhat. We start to later in the 14th century, we're kind of in the 13th century as well, two-handed grips start to become popular on some swords, but one-handed swords still very popular. And the blades, generally speaking, start to get a little bit more tapered on general. That was actually something that already started in the Viking era, but they become more important as cut and thrust weapons, and the point becomes very important with the adoption of increasing amounts of plate armor, which is something that really is something of the 13th century. So originally plate defenses on the torso, but then on the legs, also on the arms, and obviously we've got plate helmets throughout this time. But by the time we get to the 14th and 15th century, we're dealing with an enormous amount of plate, sometimes iron, sometimes steel, sometimes hardened steel. Now, you've got to think about the fact that swords going against this kind of thing are now in a completely different world to what they were when they were just facing a male shirt or some clothes and, one little helmet on the top there that for the most part you probably avoid hitting. You aim for something that doesn't have a large steel plate on it. By the time we get to the second half of the 14th century and all the way through the 15th century, we're dealing with people, in some cases, not all obviously, not all soldiers are wearing it, but in some cases who are fully encased in plate armour. But let's just talk about those soldiers who aren't knights or men-at-arms and aren't fully encased in plate armour. Even people like archers and billmen and pikemen are wearing something like a plate sallet, sometimes a bever, a brigandine over a mail shirt. So you've got plate over mail now, even for common soldiers. Sometimes they have plate defences on their arms and hands, not always, certainly not archers, not usually, but sometimes plate defences on the legs, sometimes not. But the fact is there is a lot of metal plate around. So swords like this are now having to impact and survive the impact against hitting large amounts of plate armour and also mail, and that introduces certain requirements of them that simply aren't needed from swords in certain other parts of the world. A Moro Kris isn't designed to impact metal armour. For the most part, a Chinese Dao is not particularly designed to impact metal armour. The Chinese did have metal armour and they did have specialised weapons for dealing with it, but the Dao, not really it. The Japanese katana and tachi and even naginata can sort of deal with certain degrees of armour. Lamela and obviously plate kabuto, they do have metal armour, but it's not quite the same as medieval European armour. It's not as all-encompassing, and there's probably not as much of it. And most of their soldiers, the typical musketeers and spearmen, in Japan for example, or indeed in China or Korea, didn't have that armour. Most of them would have had some type of hat, protective hat, and very little armour on their bodies, not usually on their arms and legs, even if they had some on their torso. So for that reason we start to get swords that develop, and this isn't unique to Europe. Obviously the Chinese had their specific types of sword and mace designed for dealing with armour, and so did the Persians and the Mamluks and various other people. But in Europe many typical swords give up cutting capacity to become better thrusting implements. Okay, this is to all intents and purposes, or it looks like a normal sword. This is modelled on one of the Royal Armourers. It's incredibly thick, which gives a very broad edge angle and turns it into a bar, which is absolutely fantastic for fighting in armour and half swording, because it means it's very stiff, it's very pointy, it's good for stabbing in gaps. It is not a very good cutter, but it is a very good bludgeoning bar. So, I can see how a Victorian or Edwardian historian might look at a sword like this in the Royal Armourers and go, oh, medieval swords were not really sharp. They were nothing really but pointy crowbars for fighting in armour. Well, in that case, in that specific case, I actually wouldn't necessarily disagree with that antiquarian's appraisal of this medieval sword. But at the same time as that medieval sword, we have this medieval sword, this being a messer. And this is far more like a Chinese dao. It's got a thin blade, it's got a very shallow edge bevel, it's a broad cutting blade. Yes, you can thrust with it, but it's a broad cutting blade that will cut just as well as any other cutting sword from anywhere in the world and any other period of time. And this is something that could be carried by soldiers on the battlefield for use against people in lighter armour, or indeed carried in civilian life. That's not to say that swords like this more estoc type sword weren't also carried in civilian life, because frankly, if someone's unarmoured, then hitting them really hard with this sort of chisel-edged bar is still going to be really horrible and is still going to do the job, especially if you hit them on the head or the arm. But this isn't going to cleave or cut anything like the messer or like a katana is. And indeed, while it's a long sword on a superficial level, this is also a long sword, but with completely different qualities. This has a much more flexible blade, far worse for half swording, far harder to grip because it's broader. Also, it's less stiff. It's got a less acute point, so much less adapted to going through mail. Quite difficult to get through that through good quality mail. However, this sword, although it's also a long sword, is a fantastic cleaving sword. So this from the year, let's say, 1400. This can also be from the year 1400, but they have completely different qualities. If I was going to be using one in full plate harness, full plate armour, against armour, which one do I think would be more offensive? This one. Which one do I think would be more durable and less likely to break? This one. Which one is a better weapon for fighting in an armoured context? This one. So that sword is better for general all-purpose combat against a multitude of opponents. This one is better for fighting armoured opponents. So coming back to the original question, let's sum up. So is a medieval sword really that sharp? Well, the answer is fundamentally they could be, but they came in a variety of different types for different purposes. Remember, and this often gets overlooked, I think, people often think, oh, well, you know, people in India or Japan were just basically much better at sharpening swords and keeping them sharp. Well, hold on. Let's take the blinkers off here. We're not only talking about a world in which swords exist. Think about kitchen knives, butcher's knives, filleting knives, razor blades, scythes, sickles. All of these tools that were far more numerous than swords were could be razor sharp, to use the expression. They could literally be razors anywhere in the world, even with bronze. You don't even need steel, you don't need modern steel to make a razor blade. You can make a razor blade, if you're really good at sharpening things, out of any bit of metal, even certain types of non-metal as well, certain types of plastic and ceramic. You can make things that are super, super sharp, obviously obsidian and stone and flint as well. So the fact is that everybody in the world knew how to make things which were razor sharp. But the simple fact is that not all medieval types of sword either wanted to be that sharp or could be kept that sharp for two main reasons. One, it might be superfluous to requirement. If you're mostly fighting in armour, do you really want an edge that is super, super, super sharp? What are you going to do with that? How is it going to be useful? Filippo Vardi in the 1480s talks about his armoured fighting sword only being sharpened at the tip. Why? Well, the rest of the blade, you're not going to be chopping anything with it, you're fighting in armour. And it makes it easier to grip if it's like a chisel edge. And a chisel edge against an unarmoured person will still be very effective, but it means that you've now got something which is easier to handle in half swording, but is still sharpened at the tip, so the bit that's going to go through that chainmail voider into a person is still going to function. But, of course, if you're a civilian defending yourself on your travels or in the street, on the streets, then you can make your sword as sharp as you like it. But remember, as soon as this comes into contact with another blade or a buckler, a very commonly used defense implement, often used with these, a buckler or a helmet or any type of armor, even mail. I mean, I've chopped swords into chainmail and you damage the mail, but you also damage the sword. So that's the other thing which often gets forgotten. The sharper or finer you make the edge, the more easy it will get damaged against anything that's relatively hard, even wood in some cases. So there we go. The simple answer is that medieval swords could be as sharp as a razor because, of course, they owned razors. But they didn't always choose to make them that sharp for various reasons. Generally speaking, were medieval swords maybe not as sharp as your typical Japanese katana or perhaps your typical Indian tulwar? I would say in general, yeah, they weren't quite that sharp, usually, but they could be, and in some cases they possibly were. Some messers and other types of cutting sword used in civilian settings probably were just as sharp as an Indian tulwar or a Japanese katana. But other types of sword used in the Middle Ages, particularly against armour, particularly in war, probably were given more robust blades so that they could survive the rigours of hitting metal helmets and bucklers and things like that. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will of course continue to be, and I will see you back on the channel really soon. Take care, folks.
Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.